Latoya awoke in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, where the only sound was the faint, rhythmic beeping of medical monitors. The air carried the sharp scent of antiseptic mingling with the warmth of her own breath. Beside her, in a clear plastic bassinet, lay the newborn she had delivered mere hours ago. His tiny chest rose and fell, his small fingers curled into loose fists as he slept, unaware of the world around him. His dark eyelashes, delicate as moth wings, fluttered faintly with each breath. Latoya's gaze lingered on him, her eyes tracing the soft curve of his cheeks, the slight parting of his lips. A strange, almost painful warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading like a tide she couldn't hold back. This child was not hers, at least not according to the contract she had signed 9 months prior. She was a surrogate, a vessel carrying out the wishes of Braylen and his wife Eliza, a wealthy couple from Connecticut who had chosen her to bring their dream of a family to life. The agreement had been clear. She would carry the child, deliver him, and hand him over to his rightful parents. Yet, in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the hospital blinds, something within her fractured. She lay still for a moment, her body heavy from the labor, her mind clouded with exhaustion and something deeper, something unnameable. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in as if urging her to act. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself upright, wincing at the ache that radiated through her. The hospital gown clung to her skin, damp with sweat, but she ignored it. Her eyes returned to the infant, his peaceful form anchoring her to the moment. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the bassinet, and for a fleeting second she imagined what it would be like to hold him, not as a surrogate, but as something more. The thought was dangerous, forbidden, yet it took root, refusing to be ignored. She had signed away any claim to this child, but her body, still raw from the act of giving birth, seemed to defy the logic of contracts and agreements. Moving with deliberate care, as if afraid to wake herself from a dream, Latoya slid her legs over the edge of the bed. The cold floor sent a shiver through her bare feet, grounding her in the reality of what she was considering. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 3:47 a.m. The hospital was at its quietest, the night shift likely dozing at their stations or distracted by paperwork. She knew the cameras in the hallways would capture her every move, but the thought didn't stop her. It was as if her body was acting independently of her mind, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. She opened the small duffel bag she had brought to the hospital, its contents meager. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, a few crumpled bills, and a phone she hadn't touched since labor began. She dressed quickly, pulling on a loose sweater and jeans, her movements slow to avoid disturbing the infant. She approached the bassinet, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might wake the child. She lifted him gently, cradling his small, warm body against her chest. His weight felt natural, as if he belonged there, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. The hospital blanket, soft and pale blue, was still wrapped around him, and she tucked it tighter to keep him warm. She glanced around the room one last time, her gaze lingering on the empty bed, the folded contract papers on the bedside table, the life she was supposed to return to. Then, with a quiet resolve, she moved toward the door. The hallway was a blur of fluorescent lights and linoleum, its silence broken only by the distant hum of a vending machine. Latoya kept her head down, her steps measured but purposeful. The nurse's station was unmanned, the night shift either on rounds or catching a moment of rest. She passed a janitor mopping the floor, his back turned, oblivious to her presence. She knew the layout of the hospital from her prenatal visit, and she headed for the service exit at the end of the corridor, a door rarely used except by maintenance staff. The cameras blinked above her, their red lights like unblinking eyes, but she didn't falter. She pushed through the heavy door, stepping into the biting chill of the New Haven night. Outside, the air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of damp asphalt and distant traffic. The parking lot stretched out before her, illuminated by the pale glow of streetlights. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold, and she adjusted the blanket around the infant, shielding him from the wind. She had no car, no clear plan, only the weight of the child in her arms and the certainty that she couldn't go back. She walked quickly, her sneakers silent against the pavement, heading toward the edge of the hospital grounds. The city loomed beyond, its skyline a faint silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Latoya didn't look back as she crossed the street, disappearing into the shadows of New Haven, leaving behind the life she had known and the promises she had made. By the time the sun rose over New Haven, the news of Latoya's disappearance with the newborn had ignited a firestorm across local media. Television screens flashed with grainy security footage of her slipping through the hospital's service exit, the infant cradled in her arms. Headlines screamed of betrayal, painting her as a calculated opportunist who had stolen a child for profit. Braylen, a prominent attorney known for his sharp courtroom demeanor, and his wife Eliza, who owned a chain of upscale boutiques, wasted no time. Within hours of discovering the empty hospital room, they filed a lawsuit, their legal team drafting papers that accused Latoya of breach of contract and kidnapping. The story gripped the city, feeding into a frenzy of speculation and judgment. Reporters descended like vultures, digging into Latoya's past with relentless precision. They uncovered fragments of her life. A 32-year-old woman, unmarried, scraping by in a modest apartment on the edge of town. Her employment history, a patchwork of temporary jobs. Social media platforms buzzed with vitriol, strangers dissecting her motives with unwavering certainty. She was a gold digger, they claimed, a woman who saw a wealthy couple's desperation as her ticket to a payout. Posts piled up, each one more venomous than the last, accusing her of orchestrating a scheme to extort Braylen and Eliza. Some even suggested she planned to sell the child, a baseless rumor that spread like wildfire. Braylen stood before a cluster of microphones outside the courthouse, his tailored suit immaculate despite the sleepless night. His face, usually composed, was etched with a mixture of fury and determination. His eyes narrowed as he addressed the cameras. He spoke of justice, of the child he and Eliza had dreamed of for years, and vowed to stop at nothing to bring him home. The public rallied behind him, their sympathy fueled by the image of a grieving couple robbed of their future. Eliza, though absent from the spotlight, was described by sources close to the couple as devastated, retreating to their elegant home in Greenwich to escape the public's gaze. Their legal team worked tirelessly, issuing statements that condemned Latoya's actions and demanded her immediate surrender. The police, under pressure from the high-profile case, launched a manhunt, distributing her description to every precinct in the state. Her face, pulled from the hospital's records, appeared on every news channel, her dark eyes staring out from wanted posters tacked up in gas stations and convenience stores. Meanwhile, Latoya had fled far from the city's reach, her instincts guiding her to a rundown motel 2 hours north, nestled in a quiet stretch of Connecticut's countryside. The motel, with its flickering neon sign and peeling paint, offered anonymity, its clientele a mix of truckers and transients who asked no questions. She paid in cash using the last of the bills tucked into her duffel bag and checked in under a false name. The room was cramped, its air thick with the musty scent of old carpet and stale cigarette smoke, but it was a refuge. She kept her phone powered off, its screen dark to avoid any chance of being tracked. The infant, whom she had privately named Noah, in a fleeting moment of tenderness, slept in a second-hand stroller she had purchased from a thrift store in a nearby town. The stroller, faded and creaky, was a far cry from the pristine nursery Braylen and Eliza had prepared, but it was all she could afford. She pushed it gently back and forth, the motion soothing her as much as it did the child. Noah's small face, peaceful in sleep, held her attention for hours. She studied his features, the curve of his tiny nose, the faint dimple in his cheek, searching for answers to a question she couldn't fully articulate. Why had she taken him? Why couldn't she have left him behind, as the contract demanded? She avoided the motel's ancient television, knowing her face would be plastered across every channel, but curiosity got the better of her one evening. Flipping it on, she saw her own image staring back, accompanied by a news anchor's grim narration. The words fugitive and child abduction cut through her like a blade, each syllable twisting the narrative further from the truth. She turned it off, her hands shaking, and sat in the dark, the weight of her decision settling over her. The world saw her as a criminal, a woman driven by greed, but the reality was messier. It wasn't about money, nor was it a plan. It was a pull, an instinct that had surged within her the moment she held Noah in the hospital. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself, but it was as real as the child sleeping beside her. She moved the stroller closer to the bed, her fingers brushing the blanket draped over him. Outside, the wind rattled the motel's thin windows, and she wondered how long she could keep running, how long she could protect this fragile life before the world caught up with her. Latoya moved like a shadow, slipping from one small-town motel to another, her every step calculated to avoid detection. The police had intensified their search, their efforts fueled by the relentless media coverage that kept her face in the public eye. She stayed away from bustling cities, choosing instead the forgotten corners of Connecticut, where gas stations and diners were the only signs of life. Each new motel was a variation of the last, dingy rooms with sagging mattresses, chipped paint on the walls, and curtains that smelled of decades-old dust. She paid in cash, always in cash, her dwindling stack of bills, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Her phone remained off, tucked away in her duffel bag, its silence a shield against the digital trackers she imagined hunting her. Every time she caught a glimpse of herself on a news broadcast, her heart constricted, the weight of the world's judgment pressing down on her. The television screens in motel lobbies or corner stores showed her face alongside words like fugitive and kidnapper, branding her a villain in a story she barely understood herself. She avoided lingering in public spaces, keeping her head low under a worn baseball cap, her eyes scanning for anyone who might recognize her. Nights were the hardest. She sat by the window of whatever room she had rented, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, empty parking lots stretched into the darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a street light. She watched the stillness, her mind replaying the choices that had led her here. The contract with the fertility clinic had seemed like a lifeline when she signed it, a way to climb out of debt, to start fresh. The money promised for her role as a surrogate had been enough to imagine a new life, one where she wasn't scraping by from paycheck to paycheck. But now, that decision had turned her into a criminal, hunted by the law and condemned by strangers. She looked at Noah, sleeping soundly in the thrift store stroller, his small body wrapped in a blanket she had washed by hand in a motel sink. His presence anchored her, but it also deepened her confusion. She couldn't explain why she had taken him, why she hadn't left him in the hospital as planned. It was a pull she felt in her bones, a connection that defied the logic of the contract she had signed. Meanwhile, Braylen and Eliza refused to let the case fade into the background. Their wealth and influence ensured that the search for Latoya remained a priority. They hired a private investigator, a grizzled former detective named Carl, whose reputation for finding people was unmatched. Carl worked methodically, piecing together the faint trail Latoya had left. He interviewed hospital staff, focusing on the night of her disappearance. A nurse, bleary-eyed from a double shift, recalled seeing a woman matching Latoya's description slip out through the service exit, her movements quick but not panicked. The nurse hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming she was a visitor, but the memory was enough to give Carl a starting point. He dug deeper, combing through Latoya's past with the precision of a man who knew how to find cracks in a story. He uncovered records of her marriage, a brief union that had ended 3 years earlier. Her ex-husband, a man named Marcus, had faded from her life after the divorce, but Carl noted the detail, filing it away as a potential lead. Braylen, impatient and driven by a need to reclaim what he saw as his, urged Carl to pursue every angle, no matter how small. The investigator nodded, sensing that even the most trivial detail could unravel the case. Back in her latest hideout, a motel near a sleepy farming town, Latoya's thoughts grew heavier. She spent hours watching Noah, her eyes tracing his features as he slept. There was something familiar in the way his nose curved, in the shape of his eyes when they fluttered open. It was like seeing a ghost, a faint echo of someone she had tried to forget. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But the resemblance lingered, stirring memories she had buried long ago. She remembered Marcus, the man she had once loved, whose laughter had filled their small apartment before everything fell apart. The similarity between Noah and her ex-husband was subtle, but it gnawed at her, a puzzle she couldn't solve. She adjusted the blanket around Noah, her fingers lingering on his tiny hand. The world outside was closing in. Police patrols, news reports, the investigator hired by Braylen and Eliza. But in that moment, it was just her and Noah, bound by something she couldn't name. She knew she couldn't run forever, but each day she stayed hidden, bought her time to understand why she had chosen this path, why she couldn't let go. The courtroom in New Haven buzzed with anticipation as the trial began, despite Latoya's absence. The polished wooden benches were filled with reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the high-profile case that had gripped the state. Braylen and Eliza sat at the plaintiff's table, their faces a mask of resolve, though exhaustion lingered in the lines around their eyes. Their legal team, a group of sharp-suited attorneys, presented a compelling case, arguing that Latoya had violated the surrogacy contract and committed a criminal act by fleeing with the child. The judge, a stern woman with greying hair, listened intently, her pen scratching notes as the prosecution outlined their demand for the immediate return of the infant and severe penalties for Latoya. The public, fed by weeks of sensational headlines, had already convicted her in their minds, viewing her as a heartless opportunist who had stolen a couple's dream. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, charged with the certainty that justice would be served swiftly. Everything shifted when Latoya's attorney, a man named Daniel, whom she had hired through a discreet intermediary, rose to present her defense. He was an unassuming figure, his wire-rimmed glasses and quiet demeanor belying the bombshell he was about to deliver. He submitted a series of documents to the court, his hands steady as he explained their significance. The fertility clinic responsible for the in vitro fertilization procedure had made a catastrophic error. The sperm used to conceive the child was not Braylen's as intended, but belonged to Latoya's ex-husband, Marcus, whose genetic material had been stored in the clinic's bank years earlier under an outdated treatment protocol. A glitch in the clinic's record-keeping system had led to the mix-up, a mistake that had gone undetected until Daniel's investigation uncovered it. The evidence was irrefutable. Lab reports, DNA analysis, and internal clinic records laid bare the truth. The child Latoya had carried and fled with was biologically hers, a product of her own egg and Marcus's sperm, not the carefully orchestrated arrangement Braylen and Eliza had paid for. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The judge paused, her pen hovering above her notes. As the weight of the revelation settled, Braylen's face drained of colour, his jaw tightening as he stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Eliza, seated beside him, let out a soft gasp, her hands flying to her face as tears welled in her eyes. She buried her face in her palms, her shoulders trembling with the shock of the truth. The reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment that had upended the case. Whispers rippled through the room, a mix of disbelief and fascination as the narrative of a scheming surrogate crumbled. The clinic's representatives, seated in the back, exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale as they realized the scope of their liability. The judge called for order, her voice cutting through the murmurs, and recessed the session to allow time for the new evidence to be reviewed. Far from the courtroom, Latoya remained hidden in a rented room in a small town on the outskirts of Connecticut. The space was sparse, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper and a single crooked picture frame. She sat on the edge of a creaky bed, Noah cradled in her arms, his small body warm against her chest. The television in the corner flickered with a news broadcast, the volume low but clear enough for her to hear the anchor's voice announcing the courtroom bombshell. Her breath caught as the screen displayed documents from the clinic, the same ones her attorney had presented. The truth hit her with a force she hadn't anticipated, confirming the nagging suspicion that had haunted her since she first noticed Noah's resemblance to Marcus. The child she held was her son, not just in the fleeting moments of instinct that had driven her to flee, but in the undeniable reality of biology. He was a piece of her, a link to a past she had tried to leave behind, to a man she had once loved deeply before their marriage unraveled. She tightened her hold on Noah, her fingers brushing his soft curls as tears streamed down her face. The resemblance she had seen, his eyes, the shape of his nose, was no longer a trick of her imagination. It was Marcus, etched into the features of their son, a child she hadn't known she was carrying until this moment. The weight of her decision to run, to defy the contract and the law, suddenly made sense. She hadn't been able to leave Noah in that hospital because he was hers, a part of her heart and her history, a connection to a love she had lost but now held in her arms. The news broadcast continued, the anchor speculating about the implications for the trial, but Latoya barely listened. She rocked Noah gently, her mind racing with the realization that her fight was far from over. The world might see her differently now, but she was still a fugitive, and the truth, while freeing in one sense, had only deepened the complexity of her choice. The revelation in the courtroom sent ripples beyond the walls of the New Haven courthouse, reshaping the public's perception of Latoya's actions. News outlets, once quick to vilify her, began to shift their tone. Articles appeared with headlines that framed her not as a criminal, but as a victim of the fertility clinic's negligence. Commentators dissected the clinic's error, questioning how such a catastrophic mix-up could have occurred unnoticed. Social media, though still a battleground of opinions, saw a growing number of voices expressing sympathy for Latoya, portraying her as a mother driven by instinct to protect her own child. The narrative of a greedy opportunist began to fracture, replaced by a more complex story of human error and maternal devotion. The police, under scrutiny for their handling of the case, scaled back their manhunt. Patrols continued, but the urgency that had once driven the search waned, as if the authorities sensed the shifting tide of public sentiment. Wanted posters bearing Latoya's face remained pinned to bulletin boards in small-town diners, but they began to curl at the edges, overlooked by passers-by. Latoya, still hidden in a modest rented room in a rural Connecticut town, felt the weight of her situation pressing harder with each passing day. The room, with its threadbare carpet and a single window overlooking a quiet field, had become both her sanctuary and her prison. She watched Noah sleep, his small chest rising and falling in the thrift store stroller, and knew she could no longer sustain her life on the run. The money in her duffel bag had dwindled to a few crumpled bills, and the constant fear of discovery gnawed at her. She spent sleepless nights wrestling with her options, her mind torn between the instinct to keep moving and the realization that she couldn't outrun the law forever. After days of deliberation, she contacted her attorney, Daniel, through a burner phone she had purchased at a gas station. Together, they crafted a statement explaining her actions. She hadn't fled for money or fame, as the media had once claimed. Her only motive had been to protect Noah, the son she hadn't known was hers, until the truth about the clinic's mistake came to light. She prepared to surrender, understanding that facing the consequences was the only way to secure a future for herself and her child. The trial resumed with a new focus, the courtroom now a stage for exposing the clinic's negligence as much as determining Latoya's fate. Daniel presented her statement to the court, outlining her reasons for fleeing and emphasizing that her actions stemmed from a mother's love, not malice. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the evidence of the clinic's error. The fertility clinic, once a respected institution, faced intense scrutiny. Reporters uncovered a history of procedural lapses, and former clients came forward with their own stories of mismanagement. The clinic's representatives, dressed in somber suits, sat silently in the courtroom, their faces etched with the knowledge that their reputation was crumbling. Public outrage turned toward them, with protests forming outside their sleek downtown office, demanding accountability for the lives they had upended. In Greenwich, Braylen and Eliza grappled with the emotional fallout of the revelation. Their home, a sprawling colonial with manicured lawns, felt emptier than ever. The nursery they had painstakingly designed, painted in soft blues and furnished with a crib they had chosen together, stood untouched, a painful reminder of a dream that had slipped away. Eliza, worn down by months of legal battles and public attention, spent long hours staring out the window, her thoughts tangled in grief and disillusionment. She had envisioned holding a child who would carry their hopes, but the truth had shattered that vision. The child they had waited for was never theirs, a fact that left her feeling both betrayed and unmoored. She began to question whether continuing the fight for Noah was worth the toll it was taking. One evening, sitting in the quiet of their living room, she proposed to Braylen that they let go of the pursuit. The child was Latoya's biologically and emotionally, and clinging to a claim that no longer existed felt futile. Braylen, whose anger had driven their initial response, resisted at first. His pride and sense of justice urged him to keep fighting, but as he looked at Eliza, her face drawn with exhaustion, he felt his resolve soften. After days of reflection, he agreed. They redirected their efforts, filing a lawsuit against the clinic for emotional damages and the cost of a future IVF procedure, seeking a path to rebuild what they had lost. Latoya, now preparing to turn herself in, spent her final days in hiding, cherishing the quiet moments with Noah. She fed him, changed him, and rocked him to sleep, memorizing the feel of his weight in her arms. The rented room, with its creaking floorboards and faint smell of mildew, became a temporary haven where she could be a mother without the world's judgment. She knew surrender would mean uncertainty, court hearings, possible charges, the risk of losing Noah. But she held on to the hope that the truth would protect them. She packed her duffel bag, tucking Noah's blanket carefully inside, and looked out at the field beyond the window where the first signs of autumn were turning the grass golden. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since she had fled the hospital, she felt a flicker of peace, knowing she had fought for her son, no matter the cost. 3 months after Latoya's surrender, the courthouse in New Haven delivered its final verdict. The judge, after reviewing the evidence of the fertility clinic's error and Latoya's motivations, ruled in her favor. Noah, the child she had carried and protected through her desperate flight, was legally recognized as her son. His biological connection to Latoya and her ex-husband Marcus undeniable. The court acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of her actions, deeming her flight from the hospital a response to the clinic's negligence rather than a criminal act. No punishment was imposed. Instead, the judge emphasized the need for accountability from the institution that had caused the chaos. The fertility clinic, now infamous, faced severe consequences. A substantial financial settlement was awarded to Braylen and Eliza, compensating them for the emotional turmoil and the loss of the child they had expected. The clinic also agreed to cover the costs of a future IVF procedure, offering the couple a chance to rebuild their dream of parenthood. The ruling marked the end of a saga that had captivated the public, leaving the courtroom quieter than it had been in weeks, as reporters and onlookers dispersed to process the outcome. Latoya returned to New Haven, but not to the cramped apartment she had once called home. With a portion of the settlement she received from the clinic, she purchased a modest house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The house was small, its white exterior weathered but sturdy, with a front porch where she could sit and watch the world go by. Inside, she set up a simple nursery for Noah, painting the walls a soft green and furnishing it with a crib she assembled herself. The act of creating a space for him grounded her, a tangible sign that they were no longer running. Noah thrived, his small body growing stronger with each passing day. His laughter filled the house, a sound that brought Latoya a joy she hadn't known was possible. As she watched him play, his dark eyes sparkling with curiosity, she saw traces of herself and Marcus in his features, the curve of his smile, the shape of his brow. These glimpses were both a comfort and a reminder of the life she had left behind, a life she had fought to reclaim in a new form. Each moment with Noah reinforced her conviction that she had done what she had to, no matter how far she had gone to protect him. In Greenwich, Braylen and Eliza navigated the aftermath of the trial with a mix of grief and resolve. The nursery in their home remained empty, its door closed to shield them from the pain of what might have been. Eliza spent long hours in her garden, tending to roses and lavender, finding solace in the rhythm of planting and pruning. The ordeal had tested their marriage, exposing fault lines they hadn't seen before, but it also forced them to confront their shared resilience. Braylen, whose career had thrived on control and certainty, struggled to let go of the anger that had fueled him through the legal battle. Yet, as the weeks passed, he began to see the futility of holding on to a child who was never theirs. The settlement from the clinic provided a financial cushion, but it was Eliza's quiet determination that pushed them forward. They began researching new fertility clinics, this time with meticulous care, determined to approach their dream of a family with renewed hope. The pain of their loss lingered, but they found strength in each other, choosing to focus on the possibility of a future child rather than the one they had lost. The fertility clinic, once a beacon of hope for countless families, shuttered its doors after a thorough investigation exposed a pattern of negligence. Its sleek offices in downtown New Haven stood empty, the sign above the entrance removed as if to erase its existence. The clinic's leadership faced criminal charges, their names splashed across headlines as the public demanded justice for the lives disrupted by their carelessness. The scandal sparked broader conversations about the regulation of reproductive technologies, with advocates calling for stricter oversight to prevent such errors in the future. Latoya and Noah's story, once a tale of crime and betrayal, became a symbol of the human cost of institutional failure. For Latoya, the world's attention faded as she settled into her new life. She took Noah for walks in a stroller no longer secondhand, pointing out birds and trees as he babbled happily. The house on the quiet street became their sanctuary, a place where she could be a mother without fear. The journey had been harrowing, but as she looked at Noah, now crawling across the living room floor, she knew every step had been worth it. Her love for him had defied contracts and expectations, proving stronger than the systems that had tried to define her.